This is the 50,000-watt powerhouse talk station, serving all of Arizona and beyond. 1100 KFNX, Cave Creek, Phoenix, Renaissance Radio, a division of North American Broadcasting Company.
The following program is brought to you by the Living Resources Center. Welcome to Solutions Not Excuses with Dr. Michael Hurd. For the next 60 minutes, Dr. Hurd, a psychotherapist and author, will give you the insight and answers to life's everyday problems. Remember, all comments, views, and opinions are those of Dr. Michael Hurd, his guest, and his callers. Now, let's join our program and Dr. Hurd.
Are you one of those people who thinks that criminals don't know right from wrong? Well, you would be wrong. Do you think that criminals are the hapless victims of oppressive social conditions? Nope. Do you think that crimes of passion are merely cases of temporary insanity? Nope. Do you think that watching violent television programs brings out violent behavior in children? Nope. At least not according to today's guest, Dr. Stanton Samenow. I'm delighted to say that Dr. Samenow is our guest today. He is the author of Inside the Criminal Mind, a book I have loved for years. He's also the author of Before It's Too Late, Why Some Kids Get Into Trouble and What Parents Can Do About It. And more recently, he's the author of Straight Talk About Criminals. He is one of the renowned experts in the country on the subject of criminal psychology. He's Yale and University of Michigan educated. Stanton Samenow, are you with us?
I am, and thank you for having me.
Oh, thank you for joining us. It's truly a delight. Why don't you start off by telling us why some of those things I just read are myths? See if you can convince our audience that they are indeed myths.
Well, every one of those myths I actually believed when I started in this work 30 years ago. But I have been a part of the longest in-depth research treatment program ever done in North America. It went on for 17 years, so I've been a researcher. But in addition, I've been a clinician and a expert witness, and I have dealt with people from death row on down in seriousness of crimes. And so when you have all this experience with people from all walks of life who have committed crimes, you start to see that some of the cherished beliefs to which you subscribe really don't hold up at all. For example, the view that people commit crimes because of oppressive social conditions. In almost every case where I've interviewed an offender who did come from a very, very difficult background, that offender has a brother, a sister, maybe more than one, who grew up under those same terrible circumstances, had problems that made different choices. In short, what has impressed me over the years is not the environment that a person comes from, but how he or she chooses to deal with that environment.
Now, let me ask you, do you treat criminals in therapy and counseling, or is treat really even the right word to use?
Well, I am a clinical psychologist, and so, yes, I do work with both juvenile and adult offenders. My practice is in the community, so obviously I am not treating murderers, rapists, and other violent criminals. Mm-hmm. You have to remember that there's a whole spectrum of offenders, from people who are on probation and are being maintained in the community to people who are incarcerated. I would not use the word treat, because treat implies some sort of an illness. But I am really a person who is trying to get an individual to look in the mirror at a time when he may be vulnerable and to talk to him about the kind of person he is and to work with him on the way he thinks. So it really is a process in which one focuses on thinking patterns.
Okay, Stanton, could you speak up a little bit or a little bit more into the phone? We're having some difficulty hearing you here.
Yes, I was saying that this is a process that deals with thinking patterns. It is not treatment in the sense of working with somebody who has a mental illness.
So it's errors in thinking that are really the root cause of criminal behavior. Is that what you're saying?
Absolutely. The crime resides within the mind of the perpetrator. Listen, behavior is a result of the way that we think. And so what is critical is to work with the person and the thinking errors to help him understand the way he thinks and to help him become fed up with the way he thinks and to teach that person corrective thinking patterns.
Now, what are some of the specific errors in thinking that a criminal type of personality would engage in?
I'll give you just a couple of examples, but it's important that our listeners understand that we all make errors in thinking, and it is a matter of degree. Let me give you one example.
Okay.
The kind of person I talk with pursues power and control, but for their own sake. There's nothing wrong with power and control. It's how you pursue them and how you use them if you have them. These are people who see life as a chessboard in which people and objects are like pawns. The person who said, life is a one-way street, my way, but this individual had an uncompromising view of life in which if others didn't function on his terms, he was going to make sure they did, either by misrepresentation, by intimidation, or by brute force. One other quick example. I mean, there are many, many examples.
Oh, I'm sure.
Many. But if you take lying, now, little kids lie, adults lie, people lie to save themselves embarrassment. But the kind of person I'm talking about, he lies not only to get out of trouble or to cover his tracks, but he will lie when there seems to be no purpose for it. He'll say he went to Burger King when he went to McDonald's, that he was in a blue car when he was in a red car. And people in my field will make an illness out of it. They'll say it's compulsive, that it's pathological. But if you understand the world from the standpoint of the offender, then you will understand there is a purpose even in the lie that seems to have no purpose. By lying, he preserves a view of himself and the world. There's power in lying, in the belief that you are pulling the wool over the eyes of others, that you're more clever than they.
And the criminal gets some kind of gratification out of that, right?
Absolutely. There is excitement in every aspect of it, in thinking about the lie, in telling the lie, and in believing that he has outsmarted and outwitted the person that he's talking to. And that would be true in the other endeavors, in which it's the excitement of doing the forbidden. As one person said, crime is like ice cream. It's delicious.
That's how it is from the criminal's point of view. Now, you mentioned that part of your work with criminals or people like that is to help them get fed up with their behavior. How do you help them get fed up with it? Because that's crucial to motivating them to change.
It is very, very difficult, and I am not going to tell you and our listeners otherwise. I have been to almost every detention center in the Washington, D.C. area. That's where I'm based. Mm-hmm. And it isn't because I love going to jail, but because, unfortunately, for many offenders, they have to be facing the consequences of what they have done. So in some cases, although by no means all, I have to get my foot in the door at a time where there is some vulnerability. But, this is true with all sorts of human problems. People don't stop drinking if they have an alcohol problem unless they reach rock bottom. So to get a person to even be willing to look in the mirror, I have to see that person at a time when there is some vulnerability. He knows that either something terrible has happened to him or something worse still could happen to him. And that's just for external motivators. Eventually, if I can get his attention, I then have to talk to him over time about himself, the kind of person he is, the kind of thinking patterns he has, what they've resulted in, and what they invariably will result in if he persists. It is not an easy or quick process.
Now, what kind of things do criminals, when you're in a counseling session with one, when they do get vulnerable and let down their guard, if only for a moment, even if they don't ultimately change, but if they at least let down their guard for a moment, well, first of all, how can you tell that that's really the case and they're not conning you? And then if you really don't think you're being conned, what kind of things do they say and do in those moments?
Well, one thing is very important. When I am interviewing an offender, I'm not asking him a bunch of open-ended questions about his mother, his father, his sibling rivalry, and the bad breaks he's had.
Thank goodness.
What I'm doing is I'm talking to him about what a hypothetical videotape of his life would show, and I actually initially may be doing more of the talking than he. And I will establish, and this is almost invariably true, that he has done a lot more than he's been caught for, that the crime for which he's been arrested represents only the tip of an iceberg.
Uh-huh.
And although I don't ask him to confess to particular crimes, names, dates, and places, I will talk with him about what this videotape will show, the patterns of lying, the patterns of stealing, the patterns of doing exactly what he wants to do without regard to others. So I will be really telling him about himself, not telling him anything he doesn't know, but telling him about things he does not want to face up to. Now, in terms of the person revealing himself to me, of course I don't know at any given moment whether he is just trying to feed me what he thinks I want to hear, which of course they've done all their lives, or whether I'm getting the truth. Time will tell. When you work with offenders, you don't know, nobody knows at any given moment whether you're getting the truth or not, or rarely do you know that. So the three most frequent words I use are time will tell. My position is this: I am there as an agent of change. I am there to help this person help himself change if that is what he chooses to do. He has only three choices: crime and what it will bring, which is more injury to others, including those that he cares about, such as his family, and eventually a loss of freedom. The second choice is to change, but it's to change to a way of life that he knows nothing about and for which he has had contempt. And of course the third choice is not to live at all: suicide. They think that there's a fourth choice, to play both sides of the street. But it's like being a little bit pregnant. You can't be. And trying to play both sides of the street inevitably winds up in being caught and certainly in injury to others.
Now, you mentioned earlier that personality problems, behavior problems can be a matter of degree. Let me ask you, are there degrees of criminality, and can your books be useful to someone who's not officially or technically a criminal, but has tendencies in that direction?
Absolutely, absolutely. Let me give you an example. Probably every one of our listeners has known people who are not very truthful. They're takers, they're not givers. They're people that you think you can trust. They betray the trust. They really hurt other people, but they don't cross the line into arrestable activity. The thinking errors that we've been talking about are present in these people. And yes, it is possible to work with people like this who are not on the far extreme. And when I talk about degrees, I think my example of lying was a good one. The so-called white lie. If I ask you, how do you like my tie, and you think it's atrocious, but you say, oh, well, I really like it because you don't want to hurt my feelings. That's very different from the person who lies day in and day out as a way of life. And there's a spectrum, or there's a continuum with all of these errors in thinking. So yes, it does apply at various points on the spectrum, including to people who are irresponsible but really not arrestable.
Now, you have written a book called Before It's Too Late: Why Some Kids Get Into Trouble and What Parents Can Do About It. Briefly, why do some kids get into trouble, even criminal trouble, and what do you suggest parents do about it? Is it just a matter of prevention, or are there things they can do once it happens?
Well, everybody says that he's for prevention. It's like being for the flag and motherhood and apple pie, but when it comes down to doing it, there's not much being done. My point is this: we try to identify early learning problems, physical problems, and emotional problems. Why should we not also try to identify children who are becoming increasingly destructive? I am not suggesting calling little kids criminals, and I want to make that very clear. But you could go into a fourth grade classroom, and you could say to a teacher who's spending 6 hours a day with these children, do you have anybody in your classroom who will not take no for an answer, who is uncompromising, who's sneaky, who's always trying to get away with things? The kid who's taking the shortcut, the easy way out. The kid who's trying to get his way by overpowering others or by deceiving others. You could go right down the list, and a teacher would be able to identify some of these kids. So I'm saying we need to try to spot some of these children early.
Okay, Dr. Stanton Samenow is our guest, author of Inside the Criminal Mind. We're going to talk more about kids and the psychology of crime after this break. Stay tuned.
Dr. Michael Hurd will be right back after this short break.
Are you tired of meddling politicians and self-appointed intellectuals who want to tell you what to do with your business, your health care, and your money? Take the first big step toward independence by subscribing now to the Living Resources newsletter, written by your host, Dr. Michael Hurd, and mailed to you 6 times a year. Get a free sample issue by calling 1-800-358-3606. That's 1-800-358-3606, toll free. You can also order your free issue or subscribe online at www.drhurd.com. That's drhurd.com. Look closely at the people who tell you to sacrifice. Most often they're the ones with their hands out waiting to collect. Learn to recognize the contradictions by calling 1-800-358-3606 now for your free introductory issue of the Living Resources newsletter. That's 1-800-358-3606 for the Living Resources newsletter, the modern toolkit for rational living.
Ayn Rand once summarized her ideas as follows. My philosophy, in essence, is the concept of man as a heroic being, with his own happiness as the moral purpose of his life, with productive achievement as his noblest activity, and reason as his only absolute. Do you think you have the right to the pursuit of your own happiness, to achieve the most you can in your chosen career? Do you understand how many people reject reason and want to take away those rights? The Ayn Rand Institute defends reason and rights where they are most often under attack, such as in high schools and colleges. We want students to be exposed to Ayn Rand's view of man. Ayn Rand's novels such as Anthem, Atlas Shrugged, and The Fountainhead are available in your local bookstore or library. If you would like to know more about the programs of the Ayn Rand Institute, call 1-888-SELFISH. Just call 1-888-SELFISH and ask for our information packet.
Talk to our expert hosts in the Phoenix area. Call 602-277-KFNX. Outside the Phoenix area, call toll-free 866-277-KFNX.
Welcome back to Solutions Not Excuses with Dr. Michael Hurd.
Again, if you're listening outside the area on the Internet, anywhere in the world, you can call 866-277-5369, and you can also email Dr. Hurd, D-R-H-U-R-D, at drhurd.com. We already have a couple emails in here. Dr. Stanton Samenow is our guest, the author of Straight Talk About Criminals and Inside the Criminal Mind. He is, to my knowledge, the leading expert on criminal psychology in the country. You won't find a better person to talk to on the subject. He also deals with kids who get into trouble. Stanton, you seem to be saying, in essence, or at least implying, that human beings have free will, we have minds, we can choose to correct. You're definitely saying we can choose to correct errors in thinking within our minds. But what do you say to somebody who says, well, but my emotions are so strong and my parents were so lousy to me and I didn't have any economic or psychological or psychosocial advantages, and so what am I supposed to do? What do you say to somebody who makes that claim?
Well, the fact of the matter is excuses for irresponsibility and criminality are only limited by the imagination. I actually have a huge folder of articles from journals, newspapers, and other sources that attribute criminality, and I am not kidding, to everything from physical ugliness to cycles of the moon to global warming, television, lead in the bones, lack of trace metals. I could go on and on. I mean, it goes on and on. So my answer would be to a person who did, in fact, come from a very, very difficult background and a family with all sorts of problems, I would say to that person, look around your neighborhood. Look maybe even within your home. Did you have a sister? Do you have a brother? Are there neighbors next door who grew up under the same or worse conditions? Did all of them rob banks, commit robberies, rape, use drugs? The answer is clearly no. Most people, even from some of the most terrible circumstances of life, do not commit crimes. They do not follow a criminal path. They make choices to go in other directions. And, you know, people say, well, you're letting the environment off the hook. You're saying the environment makes no difference. But I'm not saying that. The environment can provide greater or fewer temptations or opportunities, but the choice resides within the individual.
Now, you assert very clearly in your books that parents do not turn children into criminals, which, of course, is consistent with everything you just said. You also assert that peer pressure is no excuse for crime, right?
Yeah, well, peer pressure, Dr. Hurd, does exist. I mean, there's no question about it, but that's not the issue. The issue is, whom does a child choose as his companion? That's really the question. You know, I remember one young woman who I saw in the detention center. She said to me, you know, when I was a little girl, my mother always wondered why it was I didn't play with other girls my age. She reflected and said, they were a drag. They were playing house, hopscotch, board games, jump rope. I wanted something more. What was the something more? Something a lot more exciting than jump rope or hopscotch. She hung out with older kids, kind of left the neighborhood, and started to get into one little thing after another, which was exciting and, in time, illegal. So she wasn't pressured by her peers. In fact, she had to seek out peers who were running afoul of rules, laws, and restraints. People choose the company they keep.
Yeah, exactly. One's choice of peers or friends or boyfriends or girlfriends or whatever is a reflection of one's basic values.
Exactly. So when a youngster says to me, well, all my friends are doing it, whatever the illegal it may be, or my buddies turn me on to drugs, my response would be, that's probably true because those are the kids that you hung around with.
Right. I would say that, and I would also say you let them persuade you or convince you or pressure you into doing this. You let them. You didn't have to let them. Yes, they applied pressure, but you didn't have to cave into the pressure. That's the whole point, right?
Well, not only that, but certainly, I mean, I know of kids who have been with others who have gone out to commit acts of vandalism, and as soon as the youngster realized what was happening, the child walked away, wouldn't have anything to do with it. So I'm saying that people choose all the way along the line. They don't choose their environments, but they do choose their friends, and they choose how to deal with whatever life hands them.
Are too many of us in the mental health profession encouraging this excuse-making, intentionally or not?
Oh, absolutely. In fact, I remember one of the men in the study that I was part of that I referred to earlier, and this was in the early phase of the study, before we had come to the things that I'm saying now. And the man said, well, doctor, if I didn't have enough excuses for crime before I had therapy, I've certainly got enough now.
Mm-hmm.
Now, that was years ago, but nonetheless, yes, I do think that the human mind wants to understand reasons why. That's a natural thing. But there are two problems. We don't know why, and even if we did know why, that doesn't necessarily change things. So we've got to focus on the mind and the choices.
Dr. Stanton Samenow is our guest, author of Inside the Criminal Mind. We will be right back. Stay tuned.
Dr. Michael Hurd will be right back after this short break.
Therapy might not be for everyone, but good mental health is. If you like what you hear on Solutions, Not Excuses, get a free sample issue of Dr. Hurd's own publication, The Living Resources Newsletter, with no obligation by calling toll-free 1-800-358-3606. You may also visit www.drhurd.com. That's drhurd.com to get your free sample issue or to subscribe to the Living Resources Newsletter. Stop depending on bumbling politicians and self-appointed experts to tell you what doctor you can or cannot see for your health care, or how much of your hard-earned money they will let you keep at the end of the year. Treat yourself to the happy, responsible life by calling 1-800-358-3606. That's 1-800-358-3606 for your free issue of the Living Resources Newsletter, the modern toolkit for rational living.
Lots of people want to do your thinking for you. A lot of intellectuals and a lot of people in government think that the state should tell you how to run your business, or what your children should watch on television, or what doctor you must use for medical care. Some people say they know God's Word, and God tells them what you should think. Ayn Rand upheld the virtue of independence. She held that every individual must use his own mind to guide his own life. She held that the only thing you can rely on is your own ability to reason, and that you alone can and must make the decisions shaping your life. If you would like to learn more about Ayn Rand's philosophy, look for her books at your local bookstore or library. If you would like to learn more about the Ayn Rand Institute and its activities, call 1-888-SELFISH. Just call 1-888-SELFISH and ask for our brochure.
You're listening to Arizona's Talk Alternative, offering the most unique programming. 1100 KFNX, Renaissance Radio.
Welcome back to Solutions Not Excuses with Dr. Michael Hurd.
Welcome back. Our guest is Dr. Stanton Samenow, author of Straight Talk About Criminals, The Criminal Personality, among other titles. And Stanton, we're going to go to some listener emails here, but before we do that, you do have a website, right?
Yes.
Okay, and what I have here is creative, KREATIVE.net/Samenow, SAMENOW. Is that right?
That is correct.
And at that website, people can get details about all your books and order them through Amazon.com or what have you, right?
Yes, as well as where I'm speaking.
Okay, very good. And we'll read that again later in the hour. I'm going to go to some listener emails here. The first one is anonymous. There's no name given, but it's a good question. Dear Dr. Samenow, is there any scientific evidence for a genetic predisposition to crime or criminal behavior?
Well, there is no evidence of a, quote, criminal gene, but there are studies that are looking at possible biological contributors, a lack of serotonin, and other possible genetic/physical contributors. So the answer is we don't know yet, but it certainly is a valid area of investigation, and we just don't know. But let me say this. Even if there were, and notice I said even if there were a genetic predisposition, that doesn't mean that a person is destined for the penitentiary, because he still could make choices. So I don't want any of our listeners to say that genetics is destiny any more than if there's prostate cancer running in your family. It doesn't necessarily mean you're destined to die of it, because you can do things that are preventive, and if you should get it, there are ways to treat it.
Terry in Vancouver, who's an online listener, writes in the following: Dear Dr. Samenow, how true is it that people who have been abused, sexually or otherwise, become abusers themselves?
That is another myth, and I will tell you why. People who are sexually or physically or emotionally abused through no fault of their own do have problems, certainly. But again, they choose to deal with those problems in many different ways. Some blame themselves. Some become depressed. Some become suicidal. Yes, some become aggressive. And there is a literature on resiliency, and there are people who have transcended that and become model parents determined never to abuse their own children. So there are all sorts of different outcomes. The problem is that when a person is held accountable for a crime, the abuse excuse often gets a receptive ear.
I'm really glad Terry wrote in with this question, because I myself have been practicing as a counselor and a therapist for 15 years, and of course I've run into many people who have been sexually abused, and I can't think of one case of someone who was molested, of an individual who was molested who's even tempted to molest a child. I'm sure there's cases like that out there, but I doubt that there's that many. I know I haven't run into any in my whole career so far.
Well, Dr. Hurd, that's true. You see, it usually goes the other way. When people are subjected to terrible things that, certainly are not their own fault, they become determined to not repeat those patterns of behavior. And so they often are very, very conscientious about going the other way, not to do anything that's abusive. And this view that, if something happens to you, you're just going to turn around and do it to somebody else, frankly, I really don't understand the prevalence of that in the conventional wisdom, because it's wrong.
I mean, it defies my clinical experience. It defies yours. It defies your research. It defies common sense, if you think about it.
That's right.
All right. Tawana in Mobile, Alabama, another online listener, writes in, Dear Dr. Samenow, do you think it's unfair to lump drug users under the same criminal category as people who initiate violence or fraud against others, since drug users, while not engaging in irrational or healthy behavior necessarily, are not violating anyone else's rights either?
Well, I certainly would disagree that drug use is a victimless crime because, well, there are a number of reasons, but first of all, think about a person who uses illegal drugs. He is putting his family at risk by the use of those drugs, by having them even there in the house, by spending money that his family could use for other purposes on these substances. Another point is that when people are under drugs, when they're using drugs, they usually are not being particularly productive or useful or helpful to their family. So there are direct and indirect victims of drug use. Furthermore, the problem is not the drug use, but it's the mind of the user. As one person said retrospectively, he said it's thugs, not drugs, it's thinking, not drinking, which means you have to ask, what is it about the person that goes to drugs? Well, what it is, it's the search for excitement, the people, the places, where do you go, where do you get the best stuff, all that even before the effect of the drug itself.
Yeah, I myself don't believe that drug use should be against the law because what you do with your own body is your own business, even if it's irrational. That, however, is another discussion. It'd be an interesting discussion, but I want to keep it more to psychology here. What I'm interested in is if in your clinical work or in your research you have found any essential basic differences between the criminals who are in trouble for possession of drugs, let's say, versus the criminals who are in trouble for theft, homicide, assault and battery, and so forth.
Well, I think it's a matter of degree. Certainly, I'm not going to equate the occasional marijuana user or somebody who is arrested with a tiny amount of drugs or drug paraphernalia in the car with somebody who's committed murder. All I'm saying is, and this is not getting into the discussion of whether drugs should be legalized, I'm saying given the fact that drugs are illegal, you have to say, what is it about this person so that he is willing to take certain risks to himself and other people, to get the drug, to possess the drug, to use the drug. Whereas I'm not equating the two, I'm saying that there are certain thought patterns that they may share in common to a degree. And you have to remember that everything I'm saying today, if you don't think of it in terms of a spectrum or a continuum, less or more, then it sounds like I'm separating the world into the good guys and the bad guys, which I'm not.
Patrick in Jackson, Mississippi writes in, Dear Dr. Samenow, you wrote that the criminal rarely speaks of love. Why is this? Did you write that?
I did. Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely. And the reason I said that is, first of all, love is often equated with sex, or it's a sentimentality. I love my mother. But the very people whom the criminal says he loves, he will revile and hurt if, in his view, they cross him, they interpose some objection to something he's doing. How many of these men I've seen over the years who say they love their wives and girlfriends and mistreat them anytime they can't control them. These are people who are takers more than they are givers. And I understand you could probably have a round table to define love and get as many different opinions as people, but if you mean really putting yourself in the place of another person, being a loyal person, somebody who, gives as well as gets, that would not describe this person. A love relationship is antithetical to the personality of this individual.
Well, really, if you think about it, this type of person is not treating their supposed loved one as a value in their life, as an important person in their life. But by showing them no consideration or treating it as a one-way street all in their direction, they're really, in one sense, not acting in their own interest because they're not that's not exactly a way to build a lot of rapport and loyalty in a love relationship, is it, or any kind of relationship?
I agree.
So they're very short-sighted. They're often told that they're selfish and only think of themselves, which in a narrow sense is true, I suppose, but really if you look at the bigger picture, they're not acting in a self-interested way, although from what I read in your book, a lot of criminals really think they are. That's the whole thing. So, well, Stanton, can you give us another 10 minutes?
Sure.
All right, we'll be right back with more Stanton Samenow and Solutions Not Excuses. Stay tuned.
Dr. Michael Hurd will be right back after this short break.
Are you tired of meddling politicians and self-appointed intellectuals who want to tell you what to do with your business, your health care, and your money? Take the first big step toward independence by subscribing now to the Living Resources newsletter, written by your host, Dr. Michael Hurd, and mailed to you 6 times a year. Get a free sample issue by calling 1-800-358-3606. That's 1-800-358-3606, toll-free. You can also order your free issue or subscribe online at www.drhurd.com. That's drhurd.com. Look closely at the people who tell you to sacrifice. Most often they're the ones with their hands out waiting to collect. Learn to recognize the contradictions by calling 1-800-358-3606 now for your free introductory issue of the Living Resources newsletter. That's 1-800-358-3606 for the Living Resources newsletter, the modern toolkit for rational living.
Did you know that by the end of the year 2000 there will be over 1 billion computers connected to the Internet? The amount of business that will be done online is staggering. And even more amazingly, all retailers will be equal. Ma and Pa's Gifts can compete nose-to-nose with Walmart. And the only difference that the consumer sees between the two is the web page. If you want to take advantage of the unlimited potential of e-business, then you need Unimatrix International. From hardware to software, from creative graphics design to full-size networks, from single home pages to complete online stores, Unimatrix International will help bring your business right up to the leading edge. Make sure you win your share of those 1 billion computer users by contacting Unimatrix International toll-free at 1-800-434-0038. That's 1-800-434-0038. It's time to open your business to the whole world.
Talk to our expert hosts in the Phoenix area. Call 602-277-KFNX. Outside the Phoenix area, call toll-free 866-277-KFNX.
Welcome back to Solutions Not Excuses with Dr. Michael Hurd.
Dr. Stanton Samenow is our guest. I want to emphasize that I have recommended Dr. Samonow's books to my clients for years, and people, and most of my clients are not criminals, but people who have had tendencies in that direction or acknowledge to me and to themselves that they have some, I don't know what you want to call them, con artist tendencies, have found his books helpful. They actually have found them useful as self-help books. So his books are more than an intellectual treatment of the subject of criminal psychology, although they certainly are that, but they also are very, very useful and very, very practical, and his writing style is so clear and so concise, you won't be able to put the books down. So I highly recommend them. You can go to either creative.net, kreative.net/Samenow, Samenow, or I imagine you can just go to Amazon.com and do a search on Stanton Samenow, and all the books will show up, and you can also go to the bookstore, too. I want to go to another email here that has come in, actually, during the break, from Jenny in Phoenix, and Jenny writes in the following. Dear Dr. Samenow, my live-in boyfriend and the father of my little girl was arrested several months ago for sexually molesting her. He is presently in jail. Should I be concerned for her welfare when he gets out? We still speak to one another, and he tells me that he is, quote, cured and, quote, won't ever do it again. I know he cannot move back in. Do you have any suggestions? What do you think of that, Stanton?
Well, I think it's a good question. Unfortunately, as you know, Dr. Hurd, to talk about a particular person or situation without interviewing the person or knowing the person, it would be very hard to say. I mean, both are true. That can be true. That an offender can, in fact, after being locked up and not being allowed to come back to the house, he can have learned a very hard lesson. But you see, I don't know if this man's molestation of this little girl is the tip of the iceberg of other molestations. I don't know enough about him to say. So it would seem to me that somebody ought to try to evaluate this man, try to determine what sort of risk he is, and I know that's not easy to do, what sort of treatment, if any, he needs, and I'm using the word treatment, but process of change. I just don't know.
Jenny could benefit from an ongoing therapy relationship with somebody who has expertise in these matters and also works with the family as a whole as well as the individuals, don't you think?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And that would assume that this person would be open to doing that, but if he's not open to doing it, well, then I think the mother of this little girl better think twice about what sort of relationship, if any, she wants to have with him.
I want to ask you about the insanity defense. What do you think of the insanity defense?
Well, the insanity defense is really a charade engaged in by pretty clever, crafty offenders, well-intentioned psychiatrists, and the courts. And our study at St. Elizabeth's Hospital in Washington, and I say our, I was with a psychiatrist who is deceased, Dr. Yokelson. We dealt with people who were declared not guilty by reason of insanity by the courts, and they were no more insane than this telephone that I'm talking into, unless you really want to torture the definition of insanity. I think a more realistic way to proceed would be a two-phase process. One is guilt or innocence, based on the evidence in a court of law. The second question would be, even if guilty, is this a person who would be amenable to being worked with to help him change the way that he thinks, these thinking errors? So I think the insanity defense, as it is constituted in most parts of the country, really should be thrown out.
I think I read somewhere that you had said, although I don't remember for sure, but I think you had said somewhere that you are under attack from both liberals and conservatives at times. The liberals because they think you stress personal responsibility too much, and the conservatives because perhaps they think you're going too easy by talking about psychological issues and conflicts.
You've got it. That's absolutely correct. I have been criticized from both sides of the political spectrum, but you know, my work is non-political. I mean, this work started to be developed in the 1960s by Dr. Yokelson, and he died in 1976, and I have been carrying it on ever since. So this work has spanned the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, the 90s. We're now in the year 2000, and so administrations have come and gone, and various political positions have come and gone, but, you know, I'm continuing right on. So this work is not a political statement, and so political criticisms are kind of irrelevant.
Have colleagues received your works well?
Over time, the serious interest has increased. Initially, there was a lot of criticism, a lot of furor. This work was on 60 Minutes in 1977. But I have talked all over this country, and the serious interest by people who are in the trenches, who are working with offenders, both juveniles and adults, has increased, and this work is being used in many places.
Dr. Stanton Samenow has been our guest, and thank you so much for joining us today. I hope you'll keep up the excellent work.
Dr. Hurd, thank you. It was a great interview.
We'll be right back with more Solutions, Not Excuses. Stay tuned.
Dr. Michael Hurd will be right back after this short break.
Do you think it is good to be unselfish and bad to be selfish? Have you ever asked yourself what living for others does to the moral stature of those who benefit from your sacrifices? If you give, don't they receive? If they profit from your sacrifice, does that not in turn make them evil? This is one of the basic contradictions in altruism, the ethics of sacrifice, the ethics of hell on earth, and of happiness only after death. At the Ayn Rand Institute, we uphold life on earth. We believe that the free individual pursuing his own happiness by his own mind without sacrificing himself to others, nor others to himself, is the essence of morality. To learn more about this approach, Read the books of Ayn Rand available at your local bookstore or library, or call 1-888-SELFISH and ask for our brochure. That's 1-888-SELFISH.
You're listening to Arizona's Talk Alternative, offering the most unique programming. 1100 KFNX, Renaissance Radio.
Welcome back to Solutions Not Excuses with Dr. Michael Hurd.
Next week's guest on Solutions Not Excuses will be Dr. Elliot Valenstein, author of the acclaimed and controversial book, Blaming the Brain, The Truth About Drugs and Mental Health. Hope you'll join us for that. I want to go here to some Ask the Therapist questions quickly that have been coming in. And the first one is from Barb in Texas somewhere. She's asking me, can relationships between peers hinder learning among children, grade school age children, pre-high school age children? Well, can relationships between peers hinder learning? Well, it depends on what kind of relationships they are. Human relationships are obviously important, and building constructive, healthy relationships among children is something that clearly must happen. Although sometimes they can get in the way. They can distract kids and keep them from focusing on their education and their schoolwork. Probably one argument in favor of homeschooling, if you think about it, is that the kids don't have these distractions. I mean, you always hear, well, homeschooling would be wrong because kids can't socialize, whatever socialize means. But of course kids can still socialize if they're homeschooled. It's just that they, will do it in different contexts than the school classroom. I'm not trying to say homeschooling is right for every kid and it should be imposed on every single kid. I'm just simply saying that it really boils down to what kind of relationship the child has. Tamara from Mesa, Arizona writes in, for those who do choose to have a relationship with a coworker, how can they make it work? Well, that's a very interesting question. I have over the years encountered people either who are currently in or have recently formerly been in relationships in the workplace, and my experience teaches me that it is a very, very difficult thing to do or pull off for a lot of different reasons, but it's not necessarily impossible either. It's not something you have to rule out, assuming you don't work for a company that forbids it for some reason, and I don't think that's usually the case. But the issue basically is, if you're going to be in a relationship with somebody at work, it's really important that you be very reality-oriented, very rational, and that the other party be reality-oriented and rational. Now, obviously, that's true for everybody, but it becomes particularly true when you're in that kind of situation because there's a lot of extra issues involved. On one level, you have to be prepared for the worst, that the worst might happen. I mean, of course, you don't dwell on that when you're in a new relationship, but more than average, I think you have to be prepared that if this does go wrong, because there's no guarantee in any relationship, especially in the beginning, am I prepared to continue to work here with this individual? Or am I at least prepared to have to change and go somewhere else? If you can't honestly answer that question yes, then you better think carefully before getting seriously involved. And that would be my first and main advice in the beginning there. Ideally, the less closely you work together in the office place or in projects, the better. The closer you have to work together, the more an issue it can become. I mean, it's not even the working together per se that causes the problem, I have found, so much as the wider issue of the office politics. There's a lot of office politics that goes on in a lot of places, and if you, as an individual in your relationship, get sucked into that, then obviously there's going to be problems. So those are some of the things you have to watch out for. We're out of time. Hope you'll join us next week for Blaming the Brain. In the meantime, work productively, live happily, and most of all, don't feel guilty for it.
Thank you for joining us today for Solutions Not Excuses with Dr. Michael Hurd. Dr. Hurd will return next week at this same time. For your free issue of the Living Resources newsletter, visit his website at drhurd.com. That's drhurd.com. Or call 1-800-358-3606. The toll-free number again is 1-800-358-3606.